We now move on to our final speaker, who is Dr. Richard Lowes. Richard is a research fellow at the UK Energy Research Centre at the University of Exeter. And he has been developing expertise around clean heating at the Energy Policy Group, and is also on numerous advisory panels. He was invited to speak about the importance of heat electrification for net zero goals at the 2020 UK Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change. He's a non-executive direct member of the Scottish Government's Heat Decarbonisation Programme Board, and he acts as an independent advisor to gas network owner SGN, to name just a few. So, Richard, over to you.
Hi, Pippa, thanks very much, and thanks for that kind introduction. So the question really is, yes, what is the value of hydrogen for heating? And specifically, what has the gas industry been doing to promote this vision? And what is some of the, the truth behind some of the proposed solutions and the benefits of hydrogen? And you might be thinking, why is there a can of Heineken there? It's the end of the day, so it's almost beer o'clock. Not quite. If you know already, well done. If it makes no sense, you will find out later on. Okay. So really, hydrogen has emerged very rapidly onto the UK's policy agenda for heating. So when I first started working on heating about a decade ago, just over, it was very much all about electrification, district heating and energy efficiency. And that was quite simply because we knew those were the things that you could use to decarbonise heat. And they were well represented in the energy system models, and they looked to be a cost-effective option. Now, it was only really, I guess, from 2016 to the present day that hydrogen has come onto the policy agenda in such a big way. It's being heavily promoted by the gas industry, and that's obvious when you drill into the detail. You don't need to do that because I've already done some of the work, and the paper that's on this screen, that's an open access paper, so you can have a look at that in your free time if you want to. But in that paper, I and colleagues have unpicked some of the lobbying efforts that have been going on to promote hydrogen, and we've really posed the position of hydrogen that's been put forward by the incumbents and by the gas industry. We've really compared that to the best available economic and technical analysis of heat decarbonisation options. And I should be clear, when I talk about hydrogen here, I'm talking about conversion of the almost entire gas system to 100% hydrogen, so that a home that's currently reliant on methane would be converted to be 100% reliant on hydrogen. That is what is being proposed as a solution. And I should say it's still a very busy lobbying scene. If you monitor Hansard and look at parliamentary affairs, you can see huge amounts of efforts and questions and debates and parliamentary groups about hydrogen. And as net zero has rised up the agenda and climate change has rised up the agenda, and we've seen climate emergency coming onto the agenda last year and the year before, and increasingly society is concerned, the efforts have stepped up. And that's really because the gas industry has nowhere to hide. Something has to happen. And overall, I think hydrogen has been presented as easy, cost effective, and sustainable. So I thought I'd just spend a few minutes unpicking each of those things now. So firstly, in terms of easy, well, how easy would it be to convert the UK's gas system to hydrogen? Well, we know that some pipes will be suitable. So the pipes which have already been replaced from iron to plastic are likely to be suitable. There haven't been any in situ trials yet, and we don't know all the details, but certainly some of the network would be. However, we do know that significant upgrades would also be required. They would be required to increase the network capacity because there's a lot less energy in hydrogen per meter cubed. And so the actual storage inherent in the networks needs to be increased. There would be changes to equipment that's used on the gas network, particularly that associated with managing network pressure. We also know that everyone would need to have a new gas meter. Existing gas meters wouldn't work with hydrogen. And this is all the stuff on the distribution network. In people's homes, everyone would need a new gas boiler. There is talk of gas-ready boilers like HD-ready TVs, whereby you could change a component but still you'd need to go into someone's house. You can't just switch the network over. You need to turn off their appliances. Potential for new internal pipework, and that's a very uncertain area. You'd need to build a huge amount of hydrogen capacity. The existing gas system provides something like 150 gigawatts of capacity instantaneously. You'd need to make sure that that production of hydrogen capacity was there, and it would need to be there as soon as you switch the network over. And there's no solution to this big issue of conversions, which would need to be geographical. So you can't just slowly increase the volume of hydrogen in the grid. You'd need to have a switchover in the same way that the networks were switched over from Towns gas to methane in the 60s and 70s. To be clear, no options are easy, but hydrogen is very clearly also not easy. So the claim that this would be easy or straightforward, I think is unfair. Okay, on to costs then. So hydrogen is often presented as a very cost-effective option for decarbonising heat. And I think historically it's fair to say it could have been. We talked in the previous presentation about the 80% target and the move from 80% to 100%. Under the 80% greenhouse gas reduction target, that allowed some residual emissions. And if you produce hydrogen via natural gas with carbon capture and storage, that could be cost effective. We don't really know because we're not quite sure about what the carbon capture costs are and how much that would all be, but it would have these residual emissions. So effectively, that doesn't appear to be a net zero compliant option. So while that option previously looked cost effective, despite the fact it was deeply uncertain whether it would work or not, that option now doesn't seem to be able to fit in with this net zero, with the really tight requirements for the 2050 residual emissions. And so that naturally means that you need to, if you're going to rely on hydrogen, you would need to produce a hydrogen from renewable electricity through green sources. It doesn't look like hydrogen could be cost effective. I've not seen any energy system analysis that says by focusing on this 100% hydrogen pathway from green hydrogen, that would be cost effective compared to focusing on heat pumps, district heating, and energy efficiency. If you have any analysis, I'd be keen to see it. But as I say, I've not seen anything that suggests that. And finally, I think while often it's suggested that it's cost effective to use the existing natural gas grid, there is significant investment required into the gas grid to make it suitable for hydrogen, and that includes many of the things I mentioned on the previous slide, like new meters, new capacity and new pressure management. But overall, everything is likely to cost more, that's for sure, certainly in the short term. Heat pumps will cost more than a gas boiler, for example, but in general, the hydrogen pathway looks to be more expensive. Now, just because something's more expensive doesn't necessarily make it bad, but actually, the interesting thing about the hydrogen pathway is that it's quite operational cost heavy. So in a heat pump dominated pathway, you end up with lower ongoing cost because the size of the system is so much smaller because it's much more efficient. In the longer term, hydrogen could cost a lot more on an ongoing basis as well. And this slide here just shows some modelling that was carried out and formed part of a publication I was involved with, part of the UK Energy Research Centre, which basically said lots of heat pumps, district heating and energy efficiency looks like it's the most cost-effective thing to do. And just to give some idea of the costs, the investment costs required into the gas grid, this is analysis that was done for the government by Element Energy. Element suggested in their analysis, and the links down here so you can see this, the cost to make the gas distribution network suitable for hydrogen would be something in the region of £22 billion. That is a huge cost, and interestingly, it's similar to the total actual value in the gas distribution network at the moment, which is also valued around £22 billion. So while there might be some value in using the existing grid, it still does, this pathway of using hydrogen still would require significant changes and significant investment in the gas system. And this includes things like meters, gas management, pressure, safety devices, and so on. And then the bigger question, I guess, is whether this hydrogen route is really sustainable. There are two ways to produce hydrogen that I've mentioned briefly already. You can produce hydrogen from fossil fuels, and then in theory you can capture that carbon. That has issues associated with it. You'd still need to source your methane, your natural gas, and that would likely be imported as the UK moves towards higher levels of import dependency on gas. There are still significant emissions associated with that process. So there are methane emissions associated with the gas production in the first place, and those are going up as we rely more on things like shale gas and transporting that as liquefied natural gas. And there are also downstream emissions in the carbon capture process and in the steam and methane reformation process too. So as a result, it doesn't, as I've said already, look like producing hydrogen from methane with CCS at scale is really a sustainable low carbon option. Okay, so then you go to, well, could we produce it from renewable energy? Can we split water using electricity? Well, yes, that's possible, and you can do that quite easily in a lab. The issue with that is the overall efficiency of that process. When you split water using electricity, the 1 unit of electricity you go in then tends to go to something like half a unit of hydrogen. So you lose around half of your energy in the process. As a result of that, because heat pumps are much more efficient in that they extract a lot of energy from the air, you have this difference where you need about 6 times more primary energy for the hydrogen route than you would for a heat pump route. Clearly, that has impacts on costs. And when we look at the predicted costs of hydrogen, because we're not really sure what they are yet, the predicted costs look likely to be in the region, and this is from analysis by the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, so quite optimistic analysis, around 8 pence per kilowatt hour. Currently, gas is around 2.5 to 3 pence per kilowatt hour. So it's looking like this inefficiency would lead to gas bills perhaps doubling or even tripling. And from a sort of resource perspective, there are huge sustainability issues around requiring quite that much initial production in the first place. And the image on the graph here is produced by an academic at Cambridge, and the links there as well. And it just sort of shows you the scale of that 6 times different, what that would look like in terms of the amount of wind turbines you'd need, for example, to produce that much hydrogen. And of course, going into those wind turbines, lots of epoxy, lots of potential oil, lots of glass, and lots of metal to produce the wind turbine in the first place. So the smaller you can keep your system, the less resource heavy it is, and that goes beyond just carbon savings. So overall, there are concerns over the sustainability of mass hydrogen conversion compared to other options. So there is value in hydrogen, and I might not have made it sound out like there is, but actually hydrogen has an extremely important potential role in a very low carbon energy system. Its value is in that it can provide instantaneous heat, so you can burn it and you can instantly get that large amount of energy, and it's also a useful potential store of energy, but it's inefficient to produce it in the first place, and it's quite expensive. It's quite pricey, and storing it is quite pricey as well. And therefore, it makes sense that for heating, rather than burning hydrogen wholesale, which I think is an unsustainable and would be an expensive thing to do compared to other options, it makes much more sense to use it in combination with a heat pump and heavily electrified, and also a system which has got much more energy efficiency in it, rather than simply burning it. And there's probably also a wider system role there for hydrogen being used as storage, to balance electricity networks, and also to balance potential heat networks. Overall, though, I just want to make clear everything is extremely difficult. The timescales are incredibly tight, and everything requires hard work and further commitment. In my view, the emergency timescale of decarbonisation and trying to stay within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, require rapid deployment of known low carbon heat technologies, but there is absolutely still a role for further research around what hydrogen can do. It's just in the short term, we need to deliver what we know works at scale, and at the level which the zero carbon target requires. And just finally, coming back to the hydrogen reference, This is an advert, I think it's from the 70s or 80s, I'm not sure, but there was this famous saying that Heineken refreshes the parts other beers cannot reach. And I think, as well as being thirsty for a beer, this is a great way of imagining the role that hydrogen should have, not just in heating, but in energy systems in general. And perhaps you can simply change two words so that hydrogen, I've got beer on the mind now, hydrogen refreshes the parts other energy vectors cannot reach. And that's it. Thanks, Pippa.